to me, bravery is back to that place that's never been wounded. Bravery is just that acknowledgement that there's something in you that no matter how dark or difficult things get or how intense life can feel sometimes, there is a part of you that no one's ever got to and no one's ever wounded. And I think that keeping that in the back of your head brings this level of bravery out.
Hello and welcome to the Psychology Podcast. Today we welcome Niall Breslin to the podcast. Niall is one of Ireland's most formidable and inspiring mental health advocates and public speakers. He is the lead singer and songwriter for The Blizzards and was a coach on The Voice of Ireland. His award-winning mental health charity, A Lust for Life, teaches young people to be effective guardians of their own minds. He works with a diverse range of clients, including Apple, Google, international NGOs, and the European Parliament. Niall hosts the Where Is My Mind and Wake Up, Wind Down podcasts, both of which are regularly in the UK and Ireland's top podcast charts. In this episode, I talked to Niall Breslin about mental health. During his early days as an entertainer and athlete, Niall has always tried to put his best foot forward, but behind this confident exterior, he was silently suffering. It was only after he came forward about his struggles that he sought the help he needed. Instead of avoiding negative emotions, Niall encourages us to face them bravely, either through therapy or mindfulness. We also touch on the topics of education, introspection, resilience, community, and empowerment. I really enjoyed this chat with Niall. I found him incredibly sensitive and really touching. There were definitely moments in this episode in which I teared up. And I really like his message that we can find parts of ourselves that aren't wounded and that we should search for those parts of ourselves because we all have light within us. Really love that message. It really resonated with me, and I know it'll resonate with you too. So without further ado, I bring you Niall Breslin.
It's lovely to meet you.
Lovely to meet you too. It's been fun researching you.
Oh God, Jesus! That's always when you hear that, you go, "Oh no." There's a fear factor.
What does he know?
What does he know? That sounds like a threat, but I'm going to take it as not a non-threatening thing to say. But
100% non-threatening. You're an interesting cat.
Well, yeah, that's some people say that, but we'll see how we get on.
Well, it's all been an interesting journey for you.
Oh yeah, totally.
You said somewhere the first 15 years of your life you were struggling every day.
Yeah, and I suppose the context behind that would have been, I always believed I had some form of kind of post-traumatic stress kind of thing going on. I moved to Israel when I was 13 and lived there with my dad. And there was what is now called Operation Accountability, but we were in the middle of it. So it was my first realization that I'm not safe. But actually, when I really went into the therapeutic journey with my psychologist and therapist, it was really a physically abusive primary school. That was the impact. That's what kind of, I believe, had the kind of prevailing impact on my psychology throughout my life, because I learned to do what probably most people would have done. I just immediately cut myself off emotionally from the world. And it worked really well. But then, as I said, as I got older, it became quite destructive. And throughout the 90s in Ireland, the only time I ever heard mental health mentioned was when Kurt Cobain died. And I asked my Christian brother teacher what happened, and he punched his desk and called him a coward. So, a lot of my work is really not around the psychology of the individual, but I've become so interested in the kind of cultural, sociological elements of mental health and how, when I really look at it, how could many of us be any other way? And the impact culture has and society has on the individual is something I'm immensely interested in, because it had a profound impact on me.
Would you say that are you an introvert?
You see, it's kind of strange.
Have you thought about that?
I'm a frontman in a band.
I know.
People say, how could you be that? I says, because I was weirdly enough completely comfortable on stage, and people ask me why. Because most musicians will tell you it's almost an alter ego when you go on stage. It's almost a different form of reality that you're taking. And for me, it was a brilliant place to be, because I wasn't myself. And that was an escape that I really liked. And I loved music, and I loved the intensity and the noise and the aggression. And the collectiveness of being in a band when there's 4 or 5 people and you're like looking at everyone going, we all have a part to play here. And if anyone messes up, and I love that. So in terms of an introvert, socially, I think I am. Socially, I can be particularly awkward at times. But I don't think I think once I know the person, I'm incredibly good. And I love conversations, and I love chats. But I can be an introvert. I do like my own company. That's probably a good way of putting it.
You strike me as high in the highly sensitive personality. So you're probably an HSP.
Probably too much. And
well, it's possible.
Yeah, it is. And I think to the point, especially the careers that I went on, television, music, the entire part of my job was to care what the public thought of us. Which, when I look over my life, absolutely was the single worst career I could have took. Because I did The Voice here in Ireland. I was one of the coaches in The Voice, and it was 5 years.
That's so cool.
It was cool, and TV was great. But hand on my heart, if I was making a very clear decision with full clarity, I wouldn't have done it again, because everything changed. There was a sense of ownership over you, and at that point, I hadn't a clue what was going on in my head. I didn't know what my value system was. I didn't know what I stood for. I felt rudderless. And you're giving yourself to other people to decide. And that wasn't good. That's when things went pretty chaotic for me mentally. Yeah,
you had a panic attack, right?
Yeah, I did. I had quite a lot of them over the years. I had my first panic attack when I was 13 or 14. And I was sent into hospital. Well, I was sent to a doctor because I told my mother I had asthma, because I just wasn't catching my breath. I was fundamentally fighting for breath most evenings. And the doctor told me it was puberty. And I know for a fact that doctor knew it wasn't. I knew that was me kind of looking for somebody to give me some kind of answer to why I was suffocating at night. And I carried that on because in Ireland, what's really interesting from a cultural point of view, and I spend a lot of my time in America, and I work with a lot of people in America, and I love the perception that they may have of Ireland and Irish people. But really, when you get into our history and into who we are, we've a very difficult, challenging, dark past. And the reason I bring that up is, when it comes to mental health, shame was the prevailing wind in Ireland, and the Catholic Church weaponized shame and gave us the gun. And that's what happened. And we used it on each other. So if it wasn't something like, sex outside marriage, where we put women and children in prisons, essentially, it was, we were putting people in institutions. And what people don't realize in Ireland, which is really interesting from a psychology point of view, by 1950, Ireland had the highest level of people in coercive confinement in psychiatric institutions in the world. And the running joke, of course, is that obviously Irish people were just more mental illness in Ireland, but there's no evidence to show that was the case whatsoever. We loved putting people in institutions. And so for me in the 90s, this prevailing idea of institutionalization was constantly in my head, because there was a hospital in Mullingar, where I'm from, called St. Lomans. And the running joke in my town was like, your dad's in St. Lomans or your mum's in St. Lomans. And it was a kind of a joke. And I really believed that if I actually told the truth, that's where I would end up. So that type of stuff led me on this kind of silent 15 years of holding on. And I was having panic attacks all the time. And I had 10 minutes before the biggest live show of The Voice, my first live show, I had a really pretty brutal one. And I had to do the rest of the show, 90 minutes. And I was physically shaking throughout that whole 90 minutes. And that was the kind of rock bottom. That was the moment of change, or the catalyst, or whatever you want to call it.
But, you got through it. You went through the 90 minutes. How did you do it?
Because what I always say to people in my work is that people who struggle with their mental health are tougher than everybody else. and you might see the imagery in the paper where it shows you a young kid in a dark room with their hands over their heads. That is not the mental health I know. The toughest people in the world that I've met are people who've struggled with their mind, because they have to be. They've no other choice. And I think I got through it because I was strong. And John O'Donoghue is an Irish poet and philosopher who has inspired most of my work. He's actually an incredible man. He passed away recently. And he said, there's a place within all of us that's never been wounded. And I think is one of the best statements, I think, you in your work, in my work.
Yes, I love that. I'm writing that down.
There's somewhere in us. And I suppose that's the kind of core for me of what mindfulness hopefully teaches, is how can we find or access that place. And the prime example I use is the pandemic. Like, we're, 3-4 years ago, if I told everybody listening to this that this is what they're going to have to deal with, they won't see their parents or family or their loved ones, they'll be restricted with their movements, all this kind of stuff, most of us would have said, nope, couldn't do that. But you did do that. And the reason I'm saying that is maybe we're all a little tougher than we think we are. And it's that reminder of the place that's never been wounded that I go back to. That's the place that got me out of that hole before that live show and got me through the 90 minutes. Also a really good professional presenter, Catherine Thomas. I looked at her and I just nodded and I said, don't ask me anything. I'm literally just in survival mode here. And that was it. I got through it. And that very evening, I changed the trajectory of my life. I made a few decisions and I've never looked back.
Unbelievable. Yeah, I mean, are you familiar with like Dan Harris?
Yes, of course. I actually interviewed Dan on the podcast.
Wonderful. On your exemplary podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah. And he had a similar experience. He had a panic attack
TV,
on national TV. Yeah. But you had a panic attack before The Voice. You're supposed to go on The Voice, and then you still went on. Is there footage of you from that day?
Yeah.
You were like sweating. You were like, you looked highly uncomfortable.
Strange thing. My panic attacks were very physical, are very physical. They're and I hate to be graphic about it, but I think we're in safe hands here, and people listening to this podcast understand that we're only trying to help by having these conversations. But I was vomiting. I couldn't breathe and I was vomiting, and I had scrape marks on my neck from trying to pull my shirt. But the really interesting thing with TV is, like, you go and do your rehearsal and you're wearing clothes, and your producer and your director goes, right, they work on screen. That's grand. Thumbs up, you can wear that tonight. So I arrive out on live with a completely different shirt on, and the director's going like, what's going on here? Why is he wearing a different shirt? And I couldn't explain to him. I'd vomit on the other one, I'm sorry. But to me, there was an incredible power. The difficulty was I had to also advise and give feedback to singers. So what I did, you see, I learned coping strategies over the years, but what I knew purely from my anxiety was when my head is, I call it the mind riot. When my head goes on a mind riot, I need to get out of it. So I need to get out of my head and get into my body. And I just remember putting my two hands on the chair and really feeling my feet in the floor. And it was enough to ground me and get me through. But I also took beta blockers just to get through it. And it changed how I look. I wasn't frightened of live TV. I was frightened of looking vulnerable on live TV. Because that was, 10 years ago. What would have happened? What would have been said? How would have the public reacted to it? Because it's very hard to explain to people that you're having a panic attack because it looks different for everybody. But I did get through it. And that night I made a decision to tell everybody in my life that this was something I had been coping with on my own. And I told friends, I told family. I then made a decision, which was a huge one to make, because I wrote on a piece of paper that I was going to lose my job and I'd have to leave the country. But that's what anxiety does. It makes the impossible possible. And this is what I said, I'm gone, but it's worth it. So I decided to tell the public. And that came out of a discussion I had with my mother. And she said, what would have been different for the 15-year-old you if somebody had said something in the 90s about this? I said everything would have been different. I thought I was possessed by the devil, which was a viable option in the 90s in Ireland. She said, speak to the 15-year-old you. That's what you do here. And then I came out publicly. It was the biggest TV show in the country. And I came out and I expected to be thrown under a bus, and I didn't receive anything but empathy. And that made me realize that maybe we are ready to kind of move and start addressing these things.
Oh, this is really powerful. Well, there's something really powerful about you, your energy. There's a lot of I've met a lot of people in my life. There's a lot of depth to you. You're a very complex figure. I can tell there's a lot going on.
There is.
There's a lot there.
Yeah.
There's a lot.
There is.
It's like zipping and zapping, and there's contradictions. I can feel it and see it all. It's fascinating.
Welcome to my mind, Scott.
Yeah. Well, I get it. I do get it. I can resonate for what it's worth.
Good. It's always good to meet people who can understand.
Definitely feel a kindred spirit. But look, I mean, there's something. It's always a double-edged sword, because the people that are complex like that tend to be able to make the most beautiful art. They tend to be the people that just resonate with the most amount of people on the planet. There's something much more beautiful about that than the quote nice person. Like the just nice person, the polite, the person who never shows any negative emotions, or at least they don't show it to others, right? They're always people pleasing, et cetera, et cetera. Those people are kind of boring. Are you right?
I've always in my work, strange, maybe it's a personal thing. Even my PhD is I've always had an attraction to darkness.
Yeah, I hear you.
And I suppose you doing what you do, it's a huge, but I struggle with the messaging we are now seeing. Because I look at things like the wellness industry, and I think they're generally quite positive, but I also look and go, hold on a sec, guys, there's an airbrushing out here where we got to be careful, because it just becomes another form of silence. Like, to me, the most important emotions in the world are the negative ones, the core ones. They teach you so much about yourself. And if you look at music or any form of art, back to John O'Donoghue, he has this quote, and he says, music is what language would love to be. I just like, this guy is just golden coming out with these things. Because often what music becomes for the artist is a way of communicating something that no one will listen to in words, or will judge them for it in words. So it's their form of communication. And it's generally quite authentic. And I think that's what audiences, when you look at the classic albums, like the album that has always had this profound impact in my life was Tom Waits' Closing Time. When you listen to it, that's what it sounds like. It sounds like a lad who's not been able to say this to his friends, but he's able to play it on the piano. And I think that, to me, is something that I've used over my life, whether it's poetry, whether it's spoken word, whether it's music. Any form of that is something I've used, and it's been immensely therapeutic. And that's why, to me, music therapy is becoming this very pervasive form of support and ally for people who might struggle with other forms of therapy.
I love music therapy.
So do I.
Absolutely. I think relevant is a quote that you said once. You said, you can run, but you can't outrun. I think that is in line with this idea of that experiential avoidance is not the answer.
Yeah. I think Louise, my partner, says, it's slightly, it's a bit more dramatic, but she says avoidance is the root of all disorder. And
it's true.
I think about it. I used to get frustrated with that. For example, avoidance is quite nuanced, I think. So I had two types of avoidance: pretending it didn't happen, or pretending I wasn't the way I was. But the other form that I thought was a form of escapism was I used to obsessively exercise. And I used to think that was a healthy way. And because exercise is a healthy thing to do and generally good for you, you kind of believe that this is, so I would pick more difficult challenges. And what I was doing was I was picking challenges that gave me zero time to think, gave me zero time to rest, because that's when I used to get up, like that's when things would go wrong for me. So I pick bigger things, and I would always believe that my happiness lay in achievement. So I would pick bigger goals and go harder and harder. And I get more and more disappointed when that feeling of, right, this is fixed now, didn't come. And it was in therapy. I had an amazing therapist. I had a few, but it was actually in schema therapy where everything shifted in me. And what shifted was, and my therapist had, and I'm not giving anything away of my therapeutic journey, I speak openly about it, was very challenged by me because I was very good at over intellectualizing what they were saying, and I was shifting them from one thing to the next. But that therapist got me to feel, and everything shifted. Like, I moved from that cerebral headspace, and for 20 years, I've avoided going into that feeling space. And when it happened, you literally fall apart, and you're contained by a good therapist, and then you're rebuilt. Or you're, but I do think in terms of therapy, it's often sold as this. I look at the ads for it, and it's like, it's this pretty thing. And I'm like, it's not pretty. For me, it wasn't pretty. It was a very difficult, challenging experience, but it worked. And it was very powerful for me.
Yeah. Dabrowski, the Polish psychiatrist, called it positive disintegration.
That's a good way of putting it.
That's what you went through.
Yeah. And that's, there's a moment, I think, for most people. I think that's why within psychology and in therapy, I'm also doing my best to normalize it for people who've said, I've gone to it, it didn't work for me, or I did a session. You need to be prepared to show up. You need to come. You have to come into the room or in wherever you go for your therapy. You have to show up. That is the thing. And I think some people aren't either ready to do that or not willing to do that. And you have to meet them halfway. And that's the thing I wanted. More than anything in the world, I wanted to not feel the way I was feeling. So I was willing to do whatever it took. And it actually was a GP. It was a GP that, like a physician, that put me on that path. He didn't immediately go, right, we're gonna drug you up here. And I was on medication for a long, long time. But, he was going, no, I think there's something else here that you need to look at. So he set me on a different path.
So interesting, and I can already see this episode being so valuable to so many people. When you feel when you feel that bubbling up, like it could come on. Like I can just speak from my own personal experience of having panic attacks when I was much younger. You could feel it. Your head kind of fucks with you. Let's just be honest. Like, you think to yourself, oh, that would be bad if I had a full-on panic attack right now. And then you think, wait, this is just how my head would go. And then I would think, well, what's stopping me from having a full panic? There's no restraints on my head right now. I could easily have one. And then it would start spiraling. And then my heart beats. And I'm like, wait a minute, I am having I don't know if you can resonate with that way of thinking at all, but that's how it was for me. And I would be, and the more public I was, the more my head would fuck with me. My head would fuck with me is what was happening.
I became so good at them. That was what I was like. I remember, and I'm sorry for, I suppose, like, as I said, this isn't about being graphic. It's about being supportive. Because anyone listening to this who's had them, they're not pretty. And as my dad has always said, and it was actually quite a helpful thing to say to me, he said, a panic attack has never killed anyone. But every cell in your body thinks that that's exactly what's happening. But I used to be able to hold conversations with my hand in my pocket. And I remember this like really difficult thing that happened to me. I was playing rugby at the time, professionally. And I was speaking to my coach, and I missed a breath, and I could feel it. It just came on, and my hand was in my pocket. And I tore the skin off my hand with my fingers just to stop myself reacting. And I told him that I had vertigo. I was like, oh, I get vertigo sometimes. And he goes, oh, you should be talking to the doctor about this. And the worst part of this is where things start to become even, you feel very alone with this, because what happened then, I would take Xanax. And I was terrified. I was being drug tested. I was a professional athlete being drug tested after games. Not every game, but you could be. And I know Xanax is not a performance-enhancing drug, but you don't want your coach to find out that you have been taking Xanax to be able to literally be able to get out of bed. So I was always terrified of that. But actually, really interestingly, on the podcast, I played professional rugby for 3 years, and I kind of thought to myself, that was the darkest time in my life. I struggled with fairly acute and difficult depression during that period. And depression to me was, I've only ever had a really acute phase of it once, thank God. But it was something that held this power over me, because it was, to this day, I haven't been able to adequately define it. I cannot define how it felt. The only line I could say, it was a complete quest for feeling any type of feeling, any form of feeling, good or bad. Well, I asked my coach, Matt Williams, who very famous rugby coach, on my podcast 2.5 years ago. And I was terrified. And I said to him, what did you think was wrong with me when I played rugby? And he said, our coaching team thought you were an alcoholic and you didn't care.
Oh, wow.
And I fell apart. And I cannot tell you how much respect I had for him, to be honest about it. But he said to me, I missed you. I will never miss another athlete again. He went away and he trained in it. And so that type of stuff really focused me in my mission for life, is that I need to start showing people a different side and a kind of a paradigm shifting conversation around what mental health actually is and how we can support people, and how it doesn't have this ridiculous idea that, like, I had a pretty wonderful life of amazing mum and dad. I have amazing sisters. I come from the country in the middle of Ireland. You know, my dad was in the military. My mum was a music teacher. And, the reason I think my head is the way it is because I cannot stop thinking and I cannot stop solving things. But do you know what the really interesting part of this, and I won't go on ages, but in therapy, what became very clear to me was I have this sometimes uncontrollable level of empathy for the people I love. I can contain it. And how it manifests for me is I worry relentlessly for them. If they're going somewhere, relentless worry. It was probably born out of attachment as a child, but it was constantly worried about them, constantly. Are they okay? Do they have enough money? Are they sleeping all right? And I would think about them all the time. And I remember my therapist going, that makes you a very good person. And I used to get angry with that, but that to me is what you need to hear sometimes, because you feel like it feels like you're going crazy sometimes.
Yeah. But that is a label that you put on top of the experience. As you know, one of the great aspects of mindfulness, one of the great benefits, is you can train yourself to just experience the concrete sensations without causing your own suffering. Mm-hmm. Have you changed your relationship to yourself?
Yeah.
Through meditation?
You know what? I went on the journey of meditation. I did my master's in mindfulness-based interventions. I've committed the last 6 years of my life to it. It's part of my PhD. Psychosocial interventions. I teach young kids. I develop schools programs and books for young kids with mindfulness. But I have a different relationship with mindfulness than a lot of people may have. I really struggled with meditation because the biggest manifestation of my panic disorder or my panic attacks were my breath. I had a very negative relationship with my breath. So I had to change that. And then I started to realize, it's not necessarily about the breath. I looked at other avenues into meditation and mindfulness. But what changed my relationship with myself was Buddhism. And
oh, wow. Interesting.
I was raised in a deeply, deeply conservative Catholic country. And that's still, Catholicism in Ireland is pretty much over for an abundance of reasons. There was a huge level of historical institutional abuse, child abuse, that the world around the world knows what happened in Ireland, and things like the Magna Laundries. So there was a gargantuan abuse of power by the Catholic Church that has led to the Catholic Church all but being over. But there's still a relationship between church and state. So most of our schools are run by Catholic churches. Some of our hospitals are. So there's a huge conflict here. But mindfulness is, in some of the schools that I've gone into, they perceive mindfulness as a form of religion and Buddhism. So they're quite reluctant for you to go in and talk to young kids about what this actually is. But actually, I know when John Kabat-Zinn brought, mindfulness to the hospitals in Boston, he kept it secular. But I actually think it's crucial that we give people the Buddhist language around why mindfulness has such a prevailing power and potential power for people. I think taking it out, I can understand why people do that, but I think we're missing a beat if we do that, because it's the language of Buddhism that makes mindfulness make sense for me. So yeah, I teach, but many times I have to take that Buddhist element out of it, but I bring it in other ways, like, the first noble truth of suffering being an inevitable part of existence, that was game changing for me. That line, suffering is part of life. It's not the only part of life, absolutely. And actually, as soon as you accept that, ironically, you start suffering less. There's a change, there's a cessation of holding on to that, which is obviously the idea of aversion and attachment. Letting go of this stuff sometimes. But here's where it gets interesting for me is the reason mindfulness feels so challenging for people and why Buddhism is often removed from it is because it goes against the entire economic and social models that now run the world. Neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is essentially the opposite for me of mindfulness, and it dictates most of the Western world. So there's this kind of interesting jarring going on between culture, sociology, and psychology. And we're at this alliance. And it's the alliance and the intersection that I'm most interested in. But for me, mindfulness over anything, it was actually emotional focused therapy that I did with my therapist that got me to sit with that horrendous feeling of trauma that I had run from for so long. And that trauma was, there was few of them there, but it was physically being badly beaten up by a teacher, having been hit across the face with a piece of leather with plastic in the middle. That was the weapon of choice of the Christian Brothers in Ireland. And they hit children with it every single day. So
Jesus Christ,
these are the realities of it. And I still remember those. I still remember that day when I looked at a Christian brother who was foaming at the mouth as he jumped with this leather and he was trying to hit my hand harder and harder and harder. What was my crime? I ate crisps in class. So,
wow. Well, I probably would have gotten that for cursing on my podcast.
Well, you know what I mean? But that's
yeah.
And then you start to realize, and I remember with mindfulness, I was brought to that moment. And my therapist was like, what would you like to say to him? And I was all being kind of nice and going, what happened to you that you had to do this to me? And my therapist goes, Niall, your anger feels very reasonable. And he says, what do I mean? He says, be angry. And it just exploded. Like it was, God help anybody who was in the room next to me. And ultimately what mindfulness started to teach me was to sit with that discomfort, understand it. Not always, but if it came up, to sit with that. But more than anything, it taught me the space that I take up in society and the space society takes up in me. It taught me how to diffuse myself from how I was thinking. It taught me how not to fire that second arrow of suffering that the Buddha talks about. The first arrow being the inevitable stuff, and the second arrow being the shame and the regret and the rumination. Yeah. And this changed in me, along with, more than anything, my community, and actually building back up my relationships with the people I severed because I wasn't well.
Wow, that's really powerful stuff. Can we link? I want to link it to masculinity, notions of masculinity. Have you felt the need to kind of reconceptualize or broaden what a man could be in our society?
Masculinity, I think, for me is a topic that I have weirdly been obsessed by for an abundance of reasons. I mean, culturally, we're at a very strange kind of point where we're using language consistently and constantly like crisis, toxic masculinity, without actually exploring this and understanding and getting into the weeds with this conversation, the reality is men have problems and men have to accept those first. I mean, we just got to look at things. I had Richard Reeves on, who wrote a Boys and Men, an incredible book around what some of those problems are in terms of not just the suicide rates among young men, but even things like education and in home lives where fathers are becoming less and less, there. And to me, we have to be able to have these discussions. These are crucial discussions. This isn't a zero-sum conversation. And I remember when I put up on my, I think, LinkedIn, that I'm interviewing Richard Reeves about masculinity, and a HR leadership boss said you shouldn't be talking about masculinity. And I went, hold on a sec, guys, where are we going here? Where does this end? We have to talk about this. We have problems and we have to address them, and it's our responsibility to address them. So we have to have conversations around them. And she then said something about, I suppose you're going to bring up evolutionary psychology. I was like, guys, stop. Why is there always conflict? Why is there always conflict with this stuff? And it is because what we've done in the media is we've created the entire model, literally the entire model of how social media works. Its currency is division. It doesn't function without division. And the deeper that division, the better. It works. Their algorithms are designed to divide. And that is not me being that is just a fact. You can see it. So these important discussions are now being massively polarized. And the gray area, which is, as a psychologist, where most of stuff happens, is the gray area is now gone. Context gone. Nuance gone. And we have this reductionist zero-sum look at things like masculinity. I have friends, close friends of mine who've died because they believed there was a certain part they had to play in society, or a certain role that they had to be that they couldn't quite be. I was that person. I was grappling with that all my life, it was the vulnerability thing for me. It was just this idea. I call it about I had this line that I wrote in a poem about Kurt Cobain, and he said, let's not pass on that baton anymore from grandfather to father and those that came before. And it's a baton that gets passed on. A father who's a certain way of life then passes that to his son, and and I was like, I'm not doing that anymore. This isn't working for us. It's a different world, a different society, different culture, and it's not working. Too many of my friends are struggling because they believe there's a certain role they have to play in society. And that to me changed how I viewed masculinity. And I think the responsibility here is on men to do this. I think it's up to us to have these conversations with our friends, with our brothers, with our fathers. But I think we have to remove the labels, the toxic masculinities. We have to do that. Yes, there's absolute abhorrent bastards out there selling absolute bullshit on social media and TikTok and saying horrific things, and kids are picking up on that. But if you keep telling young men that they're toxic, they will follow people who tell them otherwise. That is basic maths. That is basic human maths. So if you keep using this language, it will disempower, it will disenfranchise, and people will then follow. And that is something we got to be careful with. And that's why your Andrew Tates and, there's many other examples, have this attraction for young men. That is not the answer.
Yeah. I think that there's multiple reasons why people like Andrew Tate are popular to young men. There's also kind of a drive for like power, status, money, that he also gets people excited about and activates. It's not just the masculinity thing, but it's, those kind of motives. What do you see as some of the major values that we should be having in our society today, especially among young men?
Values to me are probably at the beating heart of our emotional well-being, and actually figuring out what our values are. Our values, not what we think our values should be. Don't Google your values. Don't look at them. Actually ask yourself, what does this make me feel like when I think about it?
Yeah.
And the types of values that I think we have to start promoting. And, you can't tell people what their values are, but I think one value that I massively, massively feel is missing is community, connection, interaction. I think what we've done, and I'm back to this idea of, and I don't want to sound like a Marxist here, but when you look at neoliberalism and how it functions around individualism. So what happens in neoliberalism, and for those listening, well, what the fuck does that mean? Neoliberalism is the economic kind of ideology that you essentially leave the market to dictate and solve all problems with very little government regulation. That's generally what neoliberalism. Why is that really destructive for values? Because it promotes, as I said, individualism. I have friends that say to me, that doesn't fit my brand. Ireland calls itself Ireland Incorporated. Can we see where we're going here? So what's happening is we're pushing this individualistic society at a time when we need to figure out how to come together because we have existential threats that we need to solve. And ironically, the very thing that's dividing us the most is the very thing that said it was going to bring us together with social media. So for me, the thing I'm most passionate about is collectivism. How do we bring communities back together? How do we bring ways of connecting? And we also know from a mental health perspective, the true impact that communities can have. So that to me is something like if I go on TikTok now, when I'm finished here, it's 6 o'clock nearly in a cold, wet Irish evening, I'll go down for a cup of tea and some food. And by 7 o'clock, I'll have some guy on TikTok telling me that I'm not good enough if I'm not doing something now. I'm not a good enough entrepreneur. I'm not good enough in the gym. I'm not good enough at golf. I'm not good enough at this. This is the stuff that I think is making us feel like we're just not quite good enough all the time. And that is driven by this neoliberal agenda, I think. And my value is each day, how do I find a way to integrate myself more and more into my community? And that's just one value. You have other things like loyalty and honesty and all these other things that come off this, but you cannot practice values unless you have a community to practice them with. You cannot practice values on Twitter. Putting a hashtag in front of a word doesn't make you that thing. Be kind. That's not how it works. I'm sorry. It doesn't work that way. You can't just put hashtags in and say, that's the way I am. You got to go out and live it. You got to be it. You got to interact. And you got to develop those relationships. And to me, I think that's when things start to kind of make a bit more sense to you.
I just, the title for this episode just popped into my head. Living Bravely. I think that's what I'll call this episode.
What are you going to call it?
Living Bravely.
Yeah, I think that to me, that is a brilliant, like, brave. And what does bravery mean, right? Well, to me, bravery is the acknowledgement.
Brave.
Like, it's the same thing as resilience. So resilience is a word that's thrown around a lot. When you go into a workplace and they go, we're doing a resilience program so we can make our teams work 70 hours a week. That's not resilience. That's madness. Resilience is the ability to come back from adversity and find your way back. You guys sometimes call it psychological flexibility. Yeah. But to me, bravery is back to that place that's never been wounded. Bravery is just that acknowledgement that there's something in you that no matter how dark or difficult things get or how intense life can feel sometimes, there is a part of you that no one's ever got to and no one's ever wounded. And I think that keeping that in the back of your head brings this level of bravery out. And yeah, I think bravery, just getting out of bed and working in a world that feels very overwhelming right now is a brave thing to do. It's fairly, chaotic. John Kabat-Zinn's book, Full Catastrophe Living, it's the Bible for Western mindfulness. Why did he call it full catastrophe living? Because life is tough sometimes. And I think bravery for me is acknowledging that just some days you'll light the world on fire. You'll do something spectacular. Some days you'll literally sit in your arse and you'll do nothing. That's it. That's grand. That's life. Some days you'll just do enough to get through it. Some days you'll feel, yeah, I'm good today. And some weeks you'll feel that. And I think it's that transitory idea of life. It's not just brave. It's the truth. And I worry that often when I'm getting lectured by somebody in the wellness industry telling me that these are things you shouldn't experience, I'm going, no. I've done that, and I've done that silent thing for long enough. And I'm a very positive, optimistic person. But I'm actually okay with feeling a little ropey. It actually suits me sometimes. And I think this is the message I'm trying to get across to people. And I struggle with the conflict that I see all the time about every single thing. The reason conflict is so pervasive is because none of us are actually engaging anymore. We're not having civil debates. If you looked out your window right now and Twitter was real life, there would be houses on fire, there'd be lads screaming at lampposts, there would be, it's not real. It's not a good judgment of our metric to judge humanity. It isn't.
Women screaming at the lads.
Yeah. Absolutely, exactly, and that's the thing.
That's what you'd see.
It's just this. It's and I have this analogy that I use that some people kind of go, it's a little bit hyperbolic, but it's like, I think social media started with very positive intentions. I remember tweeting. I actually deleted my Twitter 6 months ago, a few months ago anyway. But I tweeted. Remember when Twitter was when we just used to say goodnight to each other, and then Jack Dorsey went good night to me. And I was like, you see, that, like, potentially that's what you started this as. But we have to, the fact that they're still arguing that that's what it is just completely intellectually dishonest at the highest level. And it's utterly, utterly disrespectful to the people that use it because they know that's not what it is. So the analogy I use is what social media has become is where we are ripping each other limb from limb in a coliseum. And the owners of the social media are up there watching it for their entertainment. That's what it's become. And I'm sad it's become that because it had so much potential to be something very special. And what I'm starting to learn is I have part of my study, I talk about the post-digital revolution. I genuinely believe there's going to be a mass kind of, I think there is going to be kind of a mass amount of people just rejecting social media and not technology because you couldn't exist without it, but how we communicate with technology. I think there's going to be a huge movement in the next 10 years where people just go, nope, can't do it anymore. And it might start in some countries or some communities. I know there's some communities in America where you cannot there's no kind of access to technology. I think that's a little bit difficult, but I do believe that that's what's going to happen. I think we're past tipping point, as Malcolm Gladwell calls it. We're long past the tipping point of social media because democracy is hanging by a thread and social media is standing there with the scissors. And these are the things we got to think about. And we need to protect ourselves in this. And the way I believe we do that is to build stronger communities.
I love that. Community actualization.
Yeah.
You really have made it clear you have a belief. You have a fundamental belief in human beings, and that you want to empower people to find within them and maybe around them what already exists, but maybe they're overlooking. Is that a fair summation? Yeah,
it is. And also, I think a fair thing to say is finding a way to, without sounding like, it's okay to go within yourself. And actually, I think when the modern world or the external world becomes too overwhelming for you, you need to try and find a safe space within yourself. And I think the best thing that I teach in, people ask me what's the definition of mindfulness. The psychological definition is paying attention to the present moment non-judgmentally. And it doesn't really mean a lot sometimes when you say that to somebody, but when you actually tell them about the profoundness of that, what happens? And to me, the biggest, most important phrase in that is non-judgment. Everything we do in our life, professionally, socially, and personally, revolves around judgment. Everything. There has to be a space in your life where literally nothing is expected of you, where the shackles of expectation are just gone, where this shadow of judgment is gone. And that, to me, is the biggest challenge with mindfulness, because you'll sit to meditate, you'll sit there for a minute, you'll put on some nice music, and then within 10 seconds, you're like, oh God, I forgot to ring Mary. Oh God, Mary already hates me. Oh, will I get a pizza later? I'm eating so much crap. Many calories in a pizza. Will I go to the gym before or after work? Now you're down a rabbit hole and you're anxious. And then you go, oh God, I knew I'd be terrible at this. What I'm asking you to do is recognize that minds drift. That's what they do. They love adventures. They're only doing their job. Don't follow them. See what it feels like not to follow them. And also don't beat yourself up with this. This cannot become another stick to beat yourself with. Everything else is that. This is your space, nobody else's. And slowly work with that and build that space out. And then you create this panoramic internal space where you actually feel like the most spacious place in the world is within yourself. And that's when things become very powerful with mindfulness. And you start to control your self-awareness. And to me, ultimately, what mindfulness teaches you is self-awareness, which is a superpower in a world that feels utterly vacant of it.
Yeah, and self-awareness, and also the power of just being, and which is something you talk about. And by the way, I loved your video with you're like, how often do we appreciate a good hearty belly laugh?
Yeah, that's it.
I love that.
And I think my therapist called it vitamin P, vitamin playfulness.
Yeah.
And I think the world has got so intense that some of us feel guilty sometimes to have fun or to laugh.
I know.
Or worry that somebody's filming us doing it. And yeah, I think I'm the worst at it sometimes. When you're studying, when you spend your days studying Irish institutionalization in psychiatric hospitals for 200 years, and you come out of your little study room, you're like, oh my God, I need to watch Schitt's Creek or Young Sheldon. I need to not anybody. Just I need to be stupid. I need to do something spontaneous. I need to do something for no reason. That's the other thing. Is everything we do has to be for a reason now. And I like the idea of just going, why? I'm going to go and jump in the sea and people are like, why? I was like, why not? That's back to this. And I know I keep bringing it up, but this world where we all now feel everything's transactional. Our friendships, what's in this for me? That's not happiness. To me, there's a connection in happiness. There's a feeling in a room where you can be with somebody and you don't need to speak to them and feel uncomfortable. There is a feeling that, what's it? Neuroscientists call it mirror neurons, where it feels like our brains are always talking to each other. And I learned this. I started to learn the energy you can bring into a room. You can actually bring an energy into a room. You can actually dictate the other energies in the room by what you show up with. Whether that's vulnerability or whether that's excitement, whatever it is, it's very powerful to be able to just go, right, I'm going to walk into this room. I'm in a band, and sometimes we go in and the last thing you want to do is rehearse. It's just oh God, I don't rehearse. And if you show up like that, it's just four of us going, oh my God, how do we get through this? How long is this going to be? It's so loud. But if you walk in and going, right, lads, let's nail this. Let's, looking forward to this. Can't wait for the gig of the weekend. And you mean it. It's an energy. You create that in a room. And I just think this is something I feel like part of me is disappointed that I've missed this for 15 years. And part of me actually realizes I wouldn't be able to think like this if I didn't go through what I went through. I wouldn't have this clarity. And anyone listening to this, I need to be really clear. I don't have all this shit figured out. I'm not speaking from a place of hierarchy. I am literally speaking with you. I'm down in the weeds some days. I am having the time of my life other days. I've utterly changed the labels I put on myself. And people will say, do you still struggle with your mental health? No, but I still have really bad days. I really have difficult days. I don't struggle with them anymore because I accept them. And even that language changes how you relate to it.
It's beautiful. Well, I really, I urge people to check out your podcast. You call mindfulness, you've called it the chill skill, right?
I call that for kids. So I work a lot with kids, and I work with, we've done programs with kids with sensory issues and stuff. And you have to meet them where they're at here. Trying to tell an anxious child to breathe is pointless, but giving them something, giving them a visualization, giving them a physical cue to do it and actually make them relate to it in a different way. It's one of the most beautiful things you'll ever watch. just watching kids realize that, because kids' default setting, their very default setting is to be mindful. And they're losing that too quickly, too early. And they're meant to be curious to the world. They're meant to navigate on adventures, and they're meant to just, that's what they're meant to do. And unfortunately, a lot of kids are kind of accelerating past that. So that to me is saying to kids, what's it like to be just bored? What does it feel like to be anxious? Be curious. I say to a kid, where do you feel it? And they're like, oh, what do you mean? I said, I feel it I always feel it in my throat. My throat gets a bit sore when I get anxious. Oh, I feel it in my belly. And now you're just relating with them. And now what you're doing is you're validating their emotion. And you're saying that, oh yeah, I get them too. Jeez, they're not nice, but we all get them. And all of a sudden you're speaking to a child, like you're a child. And our school, my charity, Lust for Life, we set up purely as an education, mental health advocacy charity. We are now in 50% of Irish primary schools. We will be on the curriculum by 2024, and in every Irish school by 2024, end of 2024. That's how you solve problems. Early intervention. I believe it with every cell in my body. My entire study is revolving around, if mental health intervention to this point has been so ineffective, because let's face it, we've relied generally purely on a medical model that numbs the pain. How about we look at ways of creating really strong early intervention programs in the community and in schools? What does that look like? What will that do? How will that impact young people? And that to me is how you change things. You don't change things throwing stones at them. You just don't. And I think that is, I was in America recently. I was in the West Coast. I went to some of the schools. I looked at how the education system works there. It's a really great education system, but unfortunately it puts huge emphasis on results, not enough emphasis on being a human being. Everything is kind of driven around success. Every parent I met introduced me to their child by the grades they get in school. I don't think that is the right way to bring the education system. I think it's really important that we have grades and we drive, but there has to be more to this. Education has to be more about just grades. It has to be building a well-balanced, under kind of empathetic, emotionally intelligent young people. And then we see change. So yeah, that's kind of where my heart is now, is in early intervention models of care and psychosocial interventions, working with the brilliant psychologists and the educational psychologists and the incredible people I work with to design stuff that actually works, so we don't keep relying on a crisis model, because that's all we're doing here in Ireland, and we have a population of 5 million people. If we can't get it right here, you know what I mean? And Ireland has a hugely strong international reputation. If we can prove we can make this work here, and we can really make it kind of a framework, why can't we start looking at other countries? And unfortunately in America, you know, you've kids more worried about going to school than what they learn there. And somewhere along the line, people are going to realize that's the real madness, you know. And to me, I think we can do better, but I think it's going to take back to the bravery. It's going to take brave leadership, brave communities, and brave individuals to do it.
Yes. Look, Bressy, if I may call you that.
Call me whatever you want.
Are you still performing? That's your performing
name,
right?
We still play. I do anything that makes me happy. So I golf, I play music, I kayak, I study, I do whatever comes my way, and I'm very privileged to be able to do it.
That's awesome. And and you have this podcast, Where Is My Mind?
Mm-hmm. That is,
I can't get that song out of my head now that I watched that video.
I used to play that. I played that at one of our graduation things in school years ago, and it was like the Christian Brothers thought I was like, that's devil music. But no, I think that particular track has a sound or a tone or an energy in it that kind of really represented the melancholy and the sometimes hilarity of my mind. And I think that's what I love about that song. It's not sad, it's just strange, and that was me.
Well, I loved this episode, and I do think it'll be really powerful for a lot of people. I feel real privileged that you came on the show today, so thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Psychology Podcast. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to join in the discussion at thepsychologypodcast.com or on our YouTube page, The Psychology Podcast. We also put up some videos of some episodes on our YouTube page as well, so you'll want to check that out. Thanks for being such a great supporter of the show, and tune in next time for more on the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity.